Hello. In this video, I'm going to continue my look at velocity as a modulation source. I covered most of the basics in the last video, so this time around, I'm going to spend most of the time exploring a single patch, which uses sequence velocity to modulate the filter. But as you'll see throughout the video, you can get a bunch of different sounds from it. There's an index in the description and links to patch diagrams. Before getting to the walkthrough, I'm going to do an extended demo of the first variation of the patch. Then after the tutorial, I'll do another extended demo. All right, we're going to start with something fairly simple. We've got all oscillators set at the same octave, 8 feet, and they're all set to pulse width. They're all up at around 9 o'clock in the mixer, just before saturation. The filter is in stereo mode. The cutoff is around the halfway point. The resonance is pretty high on both sides of the filter, up at around 12 o'clock. Spacing's at 0, key tracking's at 0, and envelope amount is at 0. And I'm in 4-voice paraphonic mode. Okay, good starting point. Let's start by patching the velocity out of the sequencer, ARP sequencer. And I'm going to use it to modulate a bunch of things. So I'm going to patch it into the mult. And to clear a few things up, I'm going to start with patching directly out of the mult into the cutoff for filter channel 1. In the last video I posted, I made a mistake. I did add a correction, but for those of you who didn't see it, it is indeed possible to mirror the velocity outs of the keyboard in the sequencer, but it's not the default state of the Matriarch. If I leave it as is and patch the ARP velocity out and play the keyboard, there'll be no velocity changes. So as you can hear, we're not getting any velocity changes at all. So let's fix that. Going into global settings and turning on ARP sequencer mirrors keyboard CV, so A sharp 2, C sharp 0, and D0 to turn it on. And now it'll work. Great. Okay, now I'm going to record a sequence. Going to use a bunch of different velocities and some single notes as well as some chords. And maybe I'll stick to D minor. Already lost where I was. Shoot. Okay, we'll play another chord. I think that was step 8 or beat 4. I want to make an odd meter sequence, probably 7/4, so that's 14 steps if we're thinking these as eighth notes. And I think I'm good now. I think that's it. Let's hear it. Cool. Yeah, so that was 7/4, and you could hear the different velocities and obviously the chords and single note passages. Quick review of how the Matriarch saves sequences. We've got 4 sequencer programs with up to 256 steps per program. A sequence can be made up of up to 4 notes per step, so you can sequence chords. Cool. When in sequence mode, the ARP octave switch is repurposed as a sequence bank switch, so we have 3 banks of 4 programs for a total of 12 possible saved sequences. For this patch, I'm going to record 3 versions of the sequence I just recorded using different velocities. I find it easier to flip the bank octave switch faster, just a preference really, so I'll leave the program switch on 4 and record my different variations into the other 2 banks. And I'm going to speed up the video while I record the variations here. Okay, I'm going to patch out of the mult into the top attenuator on the left and out of the bottom attenuator to the cutoff CV input for filter channel 2. So I'm inverting and offsetting the velocity. I went into detail about that in the last video, so if you have any questions, I guess check that video out. And I'm going to remove the patch from filter channel 1, patch it into an attenuator, and back out of the attenuator into filter channel 1 again. So now we have control over the amount of modulation going to each channel of the filter. All right, let's hear it. Okay, bring up some filter modulation for channel 1. And using our offset, we'll try to get a balance in channel 2. And it seems to be fairly even around 2 o'clock. So we're going to leave it there for now. And I'll adjust my cutoff a little bit, bring it down. Maybe tweak the resonance a little bit. Now you can play with these on the fly and get some cool sounds. But let's put it back to where they were. Okay. All right, that's already a pretty cool patch. I could stop there, could spend a bunch of time experimenting with recording sequences at different velocities and see what happens. Obviously, with this patch set up, a note with high velocity will open channel 1 or the left filter and simultaneously close the filter on channel 2, and vice versa. So you can get a lot of stereo modulation along with filter modulation from this patch depending on the velocities you record with. But now let's mess around with the amp envelope. Okay, so I'm going to start with trying to get a nice punchy sequence going. So 0 attack, very, very short decay. And let's bring down sustain all the way. Now we can really dial in our decay value. And I'm going to time the release sort of to the sequence. I want the decay and release to be about the length of an 8th note. So the envelope fully re-triggers at the beginning of each note. And I'm going to lower my offset. I think the right side's a bit brighter. All right, now I think I should probably experiment a little bit with the filter key tracking. So take a listen to how this affects the sequences. I try a few different settings here. Hint would be to listen to the low notes and the high notes specifically. Okay, so there's only a subtle difference, and that's because my sequence is not very intervallic, barely over an octave, so it'll be easier to hear if I solo an oscillator. Okay, no key tracking. Okay, and you can hear the higher notes of the sequence are a little duller than the lower notes. It'll be even more obvious if I go down an octave. Now if I bring up key tracking, we can compensate for that. I talked a lot about filter key tracking in my filter deep dive series, so not going to go into too much detail here. Really, I just want to find a setting to bring out the chords of my sequence. Anyway, with filter key tracking, you can hear even just with this one oscillator how it's affecting it. Now it's off, all notes are bright, and with it full, the lower notes are a little duller, just a little, than the top notes. So it's bringing the other oscillators to get our chords back. And you can hear that, yeah, that's too dull. It'll be even more apparent if I bring those up the octave. Remember, changing the octave doesn't change the key tracking. The filter is tracking the notes I recorded on the keyboard, not the octave set by the VCOs. So with a sequence like this, that was recorded with a fairly small intervallic range, but with oscillators spread over many octaves, less key tracking is actually better. So let me demonstrate. In this case, it's much brighter with no key tracking. But I'm going to start at the halfway point for now anyway. Okay, I hope that cleared that up a bit. If it didn't, check out my filter deep dive videos. So if you record a very intervallic sequence, be sure to experiment with filter key tracking. Without it, you may lose some brightness on your top notes, but if it's set too high, you may notice a huge difference between your low and high notes. Sometimes that actually turns out to be pretty cool, so I guess the best advice would be to experiment. Conversely, with a sequence like this, that's not that intervallic, no key tracking might be the way to go. I'm going to bring those oscillators down to the same octave again, and I'm going to bring the key tracking down just a tick. That way the bass line won't be overshadowed by the chords. Okay, now let's add some delay. And I'll sync it to the arpeggiator. And try to find a time I like. It's going to be easier if I bring up the mix. Oh, something's funny. Maybe the spacing's off? Sounds like left and right aren't together. It's too much feedback. Having a hard time finding a time I like. It's because of that stereo modulation. Maybe I should mess around with the spacing. Just go with the 8 notes, I guess. And not too much feedback. Okay. That's good enough to start. Oh, I forgot to play the sequences that I recorded at different velocities. I did that so I can flip between banks on the fly to get some variation from the patch. So let's check those out. I prefer it down the octave. Okay, this is the original. Let's fix that delay. Still don't like it. There we go. Okay, variation 1. Cool. You know, those chords are a bit too bright, so if I increase the key tracking, they're not going to stand out as much. At least I hope. Okay, going back to the original sequence, and I'm going to change the offset so we hear the chords move from left to center to right. That's pretty good. Okay, and the second variation is bank 1. Okay, and that one's way different. It sounds like some of the chords I played were split to different steps. Could re-record it, but I think I'm just going to go with it for now. It will add an extra little bit of variation when we play around. Now, if we solo oscillator 1, we'll see which note I played lowest each time. And it's going to affect our bass line, obviously. Oh, you know what else I forgot about? Playing with paraphony modes with a polyphonic sequence is another great way to get some variations in a sequence. So let's check that out. Oh, you can already hear the difference. Still only have one oscillator going, but I'm in duo mode now. Go back to 4 voice, so you can hear how it changes that one note. It's due to the order I played the notes in, but also when I switch the switch. So if I switch it in the right spot, doesn't change it. Okay, anyway, we're going to bring in an oscillator from voice 2. Let's use oscillator 3 instead of 4. And bring oscillator 1 down an octave. And I'll put it into unison mode and bring in all the oscillators. And oscillator 2 and 3 are slightly out of tune, so we get a nice chorusing sound. Cool. Nice sounding bass patch. And duo. Actually, let's keep it in unison mode for a second. And work on our bass sound a little bit. Change up our wave shapes. Moving oscillators 2 and 4 to saw waves. And putting oscillator 4 up an octave. Leave oscillator 3 down. Okay, even though I recorded a polyphonic sequence, that's a cool little bass line, so let's work on the tone of that a little bit. So at the moment, the filter envelope generator is doing nothing. I'm not using it to modulate the filter, just velocity, so I'm going to patch the envelope out into my little Splix passive attenuator. Use these a lot. And out of that, we're going to go into the pulse width modulation of oscillator 1. Let's just solo oscillator 1. So this is no envelope modulation. And I'll bring it up with my Splix. And let's get rid of the delay so we can hear it clearly. Cool. Okay, now I'm just going to mess around with envelope attack decay and release values until I get a sound I like. Very short time. So now remember, sustain's going to do nothing. So I'm just going to leave it at 0. There we go. That's sounding pretty cool. No modulation, just to compare. And, oh, that's too much. Yeah, around 3/4 on my little Splix. Alright, that sounds pretty cool, but the pulse width modulation is getting buried a little bit by the other oscillators. Could just turn it up, or we could modulate another oscillator. So let's do that. Oscillator 3 is a pulse wave, and check this out. I'm going to use noise to modulate the pulse width. Nice. Sounds kind of percussive. I like that sound a lot. Dirty. Okay. I'll bring in the other oscillators. I'm going to keep 2 and 4 a little bit lower in the mix than 1 and 3. Just keep that modulation audible. And I'm going to smooth out the sequence, bring up release time a little bit. Oh, and I got to bring the delay back in, of course, too. Mess around with the balance a little bit. Okay, oscillator 3 is really standing out. I really like the sound you get from modulating pulse width with noise, but might not be the best for this patch. So let's modulate it with something else instead. Gonna patch the LFO out into a malt, and I'm gonna switch over to slewed random and really bring the time down quite a bit. And yeah, out of the malt we'll go into the pulse width for oscillator 3. Nice, a little more subtle. It's going to blend with the other oscillators a little bit better. Did like that noise though, but I think I'm going to go with this for this one. Bring up oscillator 1 a bit. Sounding good. Sounds great. Okay, bring in the others. I'm going to put 4 a little bit higher because it's up the octave, just so it sticks out a little bit. But now it's almost too clean, so I'm going to do something I showed, I think, in 2 videos ago. I'm going to use the triangle LFO patched into noise. Let's just listen to one oscillator. Anyway, triangle LFO patched into noise input. If I bring up the volume of the noise, I'm getting amplitude modulation if the LFO is not an audio rate. But it also kind of saturates it in a really pleasing way. That's too much. And bring back the noise. So we're getting some amplitude modulation, but also sort of overloading the mixer, so a little bit of saturation as well. Sweet. Okay, so that amplitude modulation isn't too steady. Let's modulate the rate of the LFO with the slewed random wave, so it just wobbles a little bit. Awesome. All right, and I've still got an open space on my mult, so I'm going to patch into an attenuator, a Splix, and use that to modulate the time of the delay. And let's bring in the modulation. And as you can hear with the delay synced, I should put it to mix so you can hear it. It's a bit of a mess. Okay, so going to go into global settings and turn on delay CV sync bend. It's just A sharp 1 and D0 will turn it on. And let's hear how that works. Oh, it will help if I actually have the delay on. Let's go to full wet so you can hear it. And we're just going to attenuate it till we get a tape wobble sound. Don't want it to switch between subdivisions. I just want it to sound like, you know, worn out tape or a broken delay pedal. But not too broken. There we go. Now you're getting that pitch wobble. Put the mix it around there. I think it sounds pretty good. Sweet. Okay, let's try it out as like a bass line. So play it down the octave. And get rid of the key tracking so it's bright. Sweet. Okay, just gonna mess around with this for a few minutes. Cool, pretty good old school sounding bass patch, but let's get back to what we were working on before. So we're going to go back into 4-voice mode and put oscillators 2, 3, and 4 back into the same octave. And I'll just play around with this patch for a minute or so, messing around with paraphony modes. Okay, you get the idea. Kind of fun. But another thing we could experiment with is round robin mode. So going into global settings. Actually, let's cancel that for a second. I want this to be up the octave. Still not crazy about the sound of the chords, so I'm going to bring them down an octave. It's a little better. Okay, that's a good balance. Okay, so back into global settings. It's G sharp 2, D sharp 0, and E0 to turn on round robin mode. And you can hear that makes a huge difference. It's changed the sequence totally. So let me solo the oscillators here, and you'll see that there's no one oscillator now responsible for a bass line anymore. But you can mute oscillators or turn them down to get different rhythmic effects if you want. But with this sequence, it sounds best with them all on. But on the plus side, I never would have come up with this sequence on my own, so it's a neat little compositional tool. Just mess around a little bit, see if I get something a little more interesting. Oh yeah, and I only hit the modifier key E0 once, so we're still in global settings, so I can easily switch back to non-round robin mode. So I could flip between those two if I wanted to. Yeah, maybe round robin's a little too drastic for this sequence, but let's mess around with it and see what we can come up with. Okay, this is definitely going to sound better down the octave. And let's see if we can make this a little more musical. Oh, it's kind of neat. I'm just going to mess around with this for a minute or two and see what I can come up with. Okay, that was fun. I think with some practice could probably come up with a pretty cool groove, but let's move on. I think we'll try recording a new sequence to change things up a bit, maybe something a little happier sounding for some contrast. So I think I'll stick to a major key this time and harmonize everything in thirds and sixes. And I'm going to switch all the oscillators down to 8 feet. I'm going to go for a gentler sound, so you're going to switch all the oscillators over to triangle waves, which of course means the pulse width modulation of oscillators 1 and 3 will not do anything, but I'm going to leave them patched just in case I want to flip over to them at some point. Lastly, I'm going to patch the mod wheel CV out from the back of the Matriarch into a passive mult, and then into the CV inputs for the attenuators, which control the velocity modulation amount. Going to patch into the bottom attenuator on the left, which is controlling the offset amount for the inverted velocity CV modulating channel 2 of the filter. And I'll patch into the CV input on the right, which controls the amount of filter modulation for channel 1. So now I can control the amount of filter velocity modulation of both channels with just one control. And just for fun, I'm going to add some reverb from my H90 pedal. Just going to use a Hall algorithm. Okay, I think that'll do it for this patch. Thanks for watching. I'll just end with this little demo.